Welcome back. We are up to our arms in video inventory, Jonathan said one lunch at a restaurant called Petit Abbé in Laverne. Paul took the last gulp from his fourth mug of Hefeweizen. Inventory, man, he said, smiling agape. I'll say RTL Group and Canal Plus, Jonathan said. You ever see a blue jay and a cardinal together, Paul said. $20 CPMs, the wheels on the bus, of course. You see a blue jay and a cardinal, Paul said, leaning forward and placing his head in his arms. The tree turns ugly as sin. Paul, you're being preposterous. Trees are tepid for a reason. It's kind of like you're in the weeds. It's just what I'm saying, the author. I was studying CPMs, I was working, not working. You get to a cardinal, and then what's called a redeeming characteristic. That's kind of what this is about. Paul, you're being preposterous. That's funny to me. Back stateside, he began an API hack. He learned to collect assembly, modern, object oriented, and relationship based code. He used his broader role to develop an audience profile where bubbles led to rare matches. By August, the campaigns had increased in performance by 50% and retention had completely stabilized. Jonathan decided to spend the month celebrating by going to Sunshine Cinema, Angelica Center, for matinees in the National Museum of the American Indian for lunch. The museum displayed hundreds, thousands of photographs, neither an impression, but rather a figment, a question baked in stuff, colorful and prosaic betrayals of geographic borders, refusing both sentimentality and familiarity. On his 23rd visit, Jonathan drew a map for an exchange market where the lock of bonded exchange risk would be underpinned by guarantees. The market would be continuous without any break in symmetry. The next night, I guess after a big night at work, he went to a jazz show at the Cornelia Street Cafe. In the basement, round tables were smushed against a stained mirror. People were seated in small chairs and a makeshift light from the bar lit stage. Jonathan sat near the light where the staff watched between marching orders. A waitress with blonde hair, a black t shirt, and a short white dress smiled the way you smile at someone you see at a farmer's market. He called out, "Hello, howdy, and hey," and she walked by unsparingly each time. Finally, she whispered, "Bonjour." He waited until the bar closed, practicing corny French in his head, and they went back to his apartment, and she was gone before he woke up. Deirdre left for Europe. Wow, before the sun set. In September, the day the Skylark Exchange was launched, Jonathan found Beth sitting on a bench at Hoyt Schermerhorn stop, having come back from a day of surf lessons on Rockaway Beach. She looked down sternly at the sidewalk, mispronounced short circuit and conduit. Jonathan bumped into her as she stopped to pick up a quota, and she smelled like saltwater taffy. She ordered seafood soup at Osaka and tested the temperature with her finger. This right here, Jonathan, this is where you and I come from. She swiped through some of her paintings and told him about her doorman, whispering when she passed by how she wasn't sure if he had once knocked on her door. She revealed a birthmark on the left wrist that looked like an acorn. She talked so much she fell asleep during the midnight show of The Third Man Waltz, a show by Bobby Kennedy at the Garden Cinema. Then they drank from Jonathan's flask in Carroll Park until he awoke with her having climbed an oak tree overlooking the playground. I made a haiku, Beth said. Let's hear it, he said. I have shampoo in my hand. The shampoo smells like flowers. I have flowers in my hair. By the transitive property of equality, he says. She laughed and he watched the leaves shake, wondering who'd pulled such a prize from the dirt. Jonathan never had the words for her, though. It wasn't enough that she was Beth, but she had to be his version of Beth. He rapped in the notion that one day he would point at a map and reveal the cosmos for what it was. And apart from a fixed point, it would instead be a city center where a claim to truth would be universal, each claim asserting a feeling that perhaps never existed in the first place. All that color. What about the coloring? The chicken scratch of calisthenics couldn't account for the sun's breath. After work, Jonathan would nod to the Italy attendants smoking cigarettes under a tin scaffolding and stop at the edge of Madison Square Park. He crossed 23rd Street, veering to the left of the Flatiron Building to make his way past the stores, gyms, and pharmacies on a coral and limestone sidewalk. At Union Square, he'd gather his backpack and shoot his eyes down the hexagonal asphalt to the seated painters, the Hare Krishnas chanting the memorial flag, then descend the stairs to the subway platform. He was often overcome by a feeling that surely in Borum Hill, where New York's vaudeville and pantomime dwellers retired, something mysterious must happen. Only nothing did. 5 minutes in, I hope to go another 5 minutes. Before New York City, it had always been adverse selection. So now we go even further back in the backstory, right? Jonathan scored a 1350 on the SATs, a 1350 on the GRE, having taken both twice, a national merit semifinalist, got 4 out of 7 on advanced, got 4 out of 5 but not 1 5 on 7 advanced placement tests. He sat on the bench on a state championship basketball team. He didn't go to his graduate ceremony at Emory and spent the semester in Brazil during graduate school. On one hand, he figured he was lazy, on the other hand, a hypocrite. He was trapped by imposter syndrome, high potential, and a will for tragedy. Still, he had an acute sense of geography, a sense that had brought him to visualize the future. He got an A in the Palestine Mandate seminar, an A minus, a C plus in decision science, failed a workshop on Orientalism. He studied in a manner you wait for a plane to take off, a sense of an Indian summer, a great song by the Doors, something missing, something to be found out. Inversion, psychology. In the spring of 2001, on an April morning his senior year, he figured out that nothing really stops. Alongside the tennis court chain link, he stopped and folded his hands on to his hips as a group of ants picked up the litter of leaves. The sun wasn't shining, it was too early to call the shadows shade, but the light spread across, and the warblers sang. Too distant to call their calls anything else, everything stopped in that neon connection. The ants didn't stop, but he knelt and lay with his head hanging over them, tracing with his finger. Jonathan smiled, and for the first time, his smile was pronounced. On those pit stops, he became trapped by a longing to leave his body, the birth of language, the sand of paper, the gasp of history. Another letter. We moved to Western Massachusetts from Glen Cove when I was 15. I was never fond of the telephone pole on the bridge above Pearl Street. I didn't even like the wood, and I loved Mike. Our house was rental property, a transition place meant to be demolished like some in transit technology. I can't picture the house anymore, but I remember the colors. The shutters were pearly blue, the panels a woolly gray, the door red. In some ways, the telephone pole was like a hockey mask I couldn't take off. In others, it was a stranger who bore down on me. Our lawn was small and mostly mud, but there were patches of grass. The trains were like a drill into the earth, a constant abiding and dividing, separate but never unsurprising. I can still remember the sounds because when you lived close by to the ocean, that's what happiness was. By the time I was a teenager, I could hear the people on the pass waiting for the trains. It was odd, but I heard the preoccupation, the blank stares, the sudden momentary lapses when they looked on one end of the platform to another. With a constant view, after the threat of time passes, sound becomes a contour for movement and life centers. Yet the telephone pole was curved as if it a petrified Coca-Cola can. The wires fell unceremoniously like a doll's hair. Before we moved, before my mom got sick, before my dad became a drunk, I had my first experience with God in a hidden room. They had gone to a movie and I went to a drawer in my parents' closet. I noticed at the end of the closet where my mom's jackets hung. Past a hanger of my dad's ties, the door was ajar. It opened to a small room of paintings. The butterflies were all mine, the wildflowers were covered in phantasmagorial blood. I stood silent and stretched thin, coy, came up for air in a ringed pond with lilies. Frogs were in midair, and a black sky held a golden crescent. My mother's brushstrokes puffed and frayed, jerked and swam. There was an ugly magenta monkey, a third monkey, with the green apple and a lemon cut in fourths. That's an altar. The stampede from Wall Street to internet advertising was based on two premises. The agencies convinced advertisers to run the spend on digital advertising as an asset. The ad as an asset approach worked because agencies finally had attribution and standards in place. Their programs weren't investments, they were policies. The second premise was a pricing model implemented across the ecosystem, keyed by a second price auction in real time. The model itself required investment in research and innovation, which went up as partnerships and consolidation. Middlemen like Skylark destroyed the publisher model and reformed the bonus tax loophole by providing kickbacks to entry level employees. Skylark was founded in 1999 after the euro was created after Kafelnikov became the first Russian player to win the Australian Open, after the American stock market peaked, and as China was about halfway from lifting 500 million people out of poverty. Charles invented a Netezza striper, a machine that could spit out results at the petabyte level in minutes. A large group of Jonathan's modicum of minutia, the minutia of detail, the parameters and metrics, then applying deduction, induction, and production. It's not rich work, service to country, that's for sure. High or mighty, but it is math based, and the evidence retrieved in however menial a way has to be reckoned with in an egalitarian fashion as well as timely. Deep down, Jonathan knew that there was nothing normal, moral, that it had a burden, but that it was about something great, about something more. That contemplation had its own cost.